Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Dr. John Henrik Clarke said everything that moves under white supremacy moves for war, and nowhere is that principle more true than it is for the race war against black people. It enabled everything from the Europeans to focus their energies on building their navies, to their genocidal invasions of Africa and the Americas, to the space race, even to the internet, which originally began under the Department of Defense as ARPANET. Now, the U.S. has sat on its hands for conflicts around the globe far worse than anything that's going on in Ukraine. This country has happily, gleefully fomented revolutions and civil wars in other countries. The bodies piled up in Iraq due to sanctions and the U.S. didn't care. More people died after the U.S. carried out its botched, hideous second invasion of Iraq, but that wasn't a real problem. No one's going to The Hague for that one. And this country has made violent, unpunished murders of black people right here in the U.S. the bedrock of American culture. You want to talk about Russians firing mortars and bullets indiscriminately at children? You just had a phony show trial for one of the murderers of Breonna Taylor, where the entire point was to prove that the government stands behind armed thugs shooting indiscriminately into apartments with bullets flying everywhere, even into units with children in them, and that's not a problem. White supremacists believe in doing outrageous violence as a way to push the envelope, and they succeed. If there's not a strong enough pushback. The enemy believes in using duality. There's always at least two sides to whatever it is that they're doing. There's what you see on the surface, and then there's what's going on behind the scenes. The Ukrainians didn't put Joe Biden in office, though a little birdie told me that they did give a lot of money to Biden and his drug-addicted son. And while you can be sure that that does factor into Biden's calculus, it doesn't account for why the geriatric racist is this hot and bothered to give the global nexus of neo-Nazis all the equipment and money that the Department of Defense can throw at them short of actual boots on the ground. This is a statement by the white powers that be. The open, blatant racism of the reporters who try to cover up their embarrassment that Europe is having yet another enormous war, pretending as if that hadn't happened in 75 years, when in reality, Ukraine's been in the middle of a civil war for at least 8 years, and in the 1990s, Serbia's war was being compared to the atrocities of World War II. This is the white media trying to memory hole history. They're trying to rewrite it before your very eyes and tell you that you didn't see what you clearly saw, giving you a pack of lies that the Europeans don't do things like this when everyone knows that war is the very thing that Europe specializes in. And I think that I should add that this is not a plea for the slave-owning and colonizing countries to intervene in any of the nations that they turned into basket cases. But it is a demand that they not pretend as if they're any better. No African country ever had 100 years war. No African country ever started a world war or a continental conflict. Practically all the European nations have. Europe's history is a history of war, and any nation that prides itself and defines itself based on armed conflict, for that group, peace will be impossible. So Biden has gotten bipartisan support to ban Russian oil. This is going to bring tremendous economic suffering on the people of the United States, but the white media is treating it as if, well, we should be proud to suffer. Sure, they do the usual political bickering, the Republicans at least, but as arch-white supremacist fiend Steve Bannon said, filter out the noise from the signal. And when I analyze the signal of what both political parties are saying, I see that they're all on the same page, that this is bad for white solidarity, and there's no price too high to pay to maintain that. Inflation is already off the charts, and with this, it's going to go into the stratosphere. Now, Biden and his felonious family, they don't care about that. They've got plenty of money stacked up. They've got plenty of Ukrainian cash. So no matter how much the price of gas goes up, no matter how much food prices go up, they don't care. Now, unless you grow your own food, or unless you've decided that you're going to be walking everywhere, you understand that everything you eat has to be brought to you. Biden doesn't care. He and his family, they can afford sky-high prices. And what is this being done for? Because the white media has made the conflict in Ukraine into a celebrity war. They've actually turned a war itself into a celebrity. And the putrid culture of online attention whoring being what it is has naturally set the stage for a lot of people who didn't care about wars in other places with body counts far higher than anything going on in Ukraine, suddenly wanting to act like this is World War I or this is World War II, and they've been moved by conscience because they have to do something. Now, one has to wonder where all of these gung-ho, trigger-happy young men who are running over to Ukraine right now, where the hell were they at when the 2014 uprising in Ukraine occurred? Or in the last 8 years of the civil war that's raged there ever since? By the way, the number of dead from that civil war, which is what it is at least 13,000. That's what's been going on in Ukraine before now. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm a little bit skeptical about people who all of a sudden want to act as if they're playing out their favorite Call of Duty video game, and I'm thinking to myself, gee, you didn't notice what was going on all this time until now? 13,000 people dead and your conscience wasn't moved? For the last 2 weeks, the white media's made sure to update us on every fatality that's taken place there, just in the last couple of weeks. And the narrative has been that nobody's doing anything about it. They've been hammering and bashing everybody over the head with that one relentlessly. Another media narrative is the myth of Vladimir Zelensky as being a uniquely charismatic and heroic figure. Zelensky is described by the white media as being a comedian. Well, he's done some comedic roles and such, but the guy's an actor, by the way, and he's also a writer. But let's focus on the acting part. Zelensky is an actor just like Ronald Reagan was an actor. By the way, Reagan had also done some comedy roles too, by the way. That got downplayed later on. Back in the 1980s, a lot of the left-leaning media and some of the mainstream folks made sure to point out that Ronald Reagan was basically acting the part of president for 8 years. But a lot of folks in the country apparently liked it because they felt as if he really believed what he was saying and doing when, as we all know now, the man was going through the outer stages of dementia. He didn't know what the hell he was doing. But then again, he didn't need to know. He just needed to make the public think that he knew. My point is that just like Reagan, Zelensky knows how to put on a performance. He knows how to project gravitas and seriousness. The same way you would see an actor like, say, Kevin Spacey playing the part of a stoic leader, that's what Zelensky is doing. And while that's not to say that the man doesn't have any guts, the truth of the matter is most leaders who have had their countries invaded have stayed even when the invading army is raging across the country. If you want to convince me that Zelensky has courage, then why don't any of the white media reporters make it a point to ask him any tough questions? Like, say, how is it that he, as the president of Ukraine, and they point out all the time he's Jewish, as a Jewish president of Ukraine, why is it that he's allowing a neo-Nazi group like Azov Regiment to be part of the very army that he commands? While Zelensky is upbraiding the entire world and saying nobody cares about the Ukrainians' plight, nobody's asking him why it is he's saying nothing about how the Ukrainians are treating the Africans there. Is it being done by his order? And if he's not the one ordering it, what has he done about it? See, that would be journalism. Anything else is propaganda. Speaking of propaganda, when I look at what's going on in Ukraine, it reminds me of a movie that sometimes gets brought up every once in a while when the U.S. embarks on a war. Yeah, I'm talking about Wag the Dog, the now classic comedy movie. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a movie that was made in the 1990s, and stop me if you've heard this one before. The plot revolves around an American president who gets caught making advances towards an underage girl in the Oval Office. Sounds like Biden, don't it? And to make matters worse, this scandal happens during an election year. Don't know if you've heard, but 2022 happens to be an election year, the midterms to be exact. Now, the scandal threatens to sink the president's administration, so he hires a spin doctor played by Robert De Niro, and De Niro's character decides the best thing to do is to create an even bigger media sensation than an underage sex scandal, and as everyone knows, there's no bigger media sensation than a war. Of course, you can't have a war without visuals, so De Niro gets a Hollywood studio to make a phony news piece claiming that there's a war in Albania, and the location is significant. It needs to be a white country in Eastern Europe because those are the only people who white society in the U.S. will care about. Their plan? Pluck the heartstrings of white America by showing a blonde female actress who they claim to be a war orphan scurrying around the ruins of her bombed-out village. Of course, it's all fake. It's on a soundstage in front of blue screen with special effects, but the American people fall for it. Now, obviously, the war in Ukraine isn't a Hollywood production, though the white media is reporting on it as if it was. There's an undeniable bad guy, an undeniable good guy, and you know who you're supposed to be rooting for. And just like with a movie, a lot of people want a cathartic and reaffirming ending to this little drama where the bad guys are defeated, the good guys are victorious, and everyone walks away from the experience with a smile. The U.S. didn't start the war in Ukraine, though it did encourage the neo-Nazi elements in the army there. One of the things that the white media and Biden have been touting is that this Russian oil ban legislation has bipartisan support. But then Biden goes on to say the country wants it. He needs to speak for himself. Reminds me of Kristen Clark and those clowns in the DOJ saying that Ahmaud Arbery's family, they want for the murderers to be able to choose where they go to prison because that's going to help them heal. Well, you got them in the courtroom saying, this is not what we want. Now, obviously, Biden and the rest of the racists on Capitol Hill, they didn't discover morality, and Republicans who have been using the talking point of the U.S. stopping the importation of foreign oil, well, now they're on board with this. They're putting their own schizophrenia on display, simultaneously saying that they support banning Russian oil, while at the same time screaming that gas prices are going to go through the roof, so that means Biden has to be voted out of office. It's all a game, but that's not to say that there's no method to the madness. War is the only thing that gets these white supremacists to all move in the same direction, and that's what's at work here. Republicans themselves made beating up on Russia a central plank of their political platform since the 1950s. Sure, they want Putin stopped, but only because, as they see it, they need to preserve the number of white people. Now, the very people who were saying how disastrous it would be to defund the police, they're quiet about all the economic damage that this hyperinflation is going to do. War has always been a very effective tool for white supremacy as a means of silencing dissent. But this is a war going on the other side of the world, and there are no American elements who are involved. The United States is choosing to get involved between a fight between a couple of thugs in Eastern Europe. And even so, they're telling the American people, indeed the world, that the fate of democracy hangs by a single thread. Well, if that thread is being held by Azov Regiment and C-14 and Right Sector, then democracy never had a chance to begin with. This is also part of the U.S.'s effort to restore its phony image as a moral agent on the world stage. The uprisings of 2020 and the protests against the unpunished murders of black people that came before and after it show the entire world exactly who and what the United States is. For decades, the world was willing to play along with the lie that the U.S. had some sort of moral legitimacy because it was a melting pot, etc. But that lie died with George Floyd. The U.S. could no longer deny what it is. It got so bad even the Chinese mocked the U.S. about it. Trump was voted out, and the white media made sure to push the narrative that Trump was the entire problem. All those black folks in the streets, why, this is about Trump, you see. It began and it can end with Trump. That's another white media narrative. If black folks are making the streets hot, then you've got to find a way to contain it, find a way to compartmentalize it. You say it's all about one guy and make Trump the fall guy. Trump refused to admit to any of the anti-black racism that happened on his watch, and he refused to do anything about it. And in a display of how anti-black racism is a bipartisan issue, when Biden took office, he's also refused to acknowledge the culture of anti-black racism that he helped to foment and to promote. What few denunciations came from the international community have been utterly ignored. The U.S. needed to rehabilitate its image, not its behavior, but just its image. And how fortuitous that Vladimir Putin finally feels that he's had enough of NATO's expansion and now the U.S. has decided, okay, this is our opening. What's happening in Ukraine is tragic, but no more than the murders of black citizens in the United States. We've been routinely firebombed from the air and on the ground. Black children like Ayanna Jones and Tamir Rice are routinely murdered by violent thugs in acts of state-sponsored terrorism every single day, and the people who murder us are not punished. Nobody's playing any sad violins from us. In fact, the white media does everything it can to demonize those murder victims. No less than Joe Scarborough was trying to justify the murder of Tamir Rice, claiming that, well, Tamir Rice, didn't he take the orange tip off of that toy gun that he had? And then when the video came out, all of a sudden, Joe Scarborough was silent. They're not trying to justify any of the deaths of Ukrainian children, but they will boldly, gleefully try to justify the killings of black children. Many of the state-sponsored thugs who kill black people in the United States are, in fact, people who immigrated from places like Ukraine. You had black folks trying to get into the country from Haiti. They had white men on horseback with whips telling them you're not getting in. Meanwhile, you got all these Ukrainians coming from places with open gangs of neo-Nazis who are in the government running things, and nobody's concerned about them. Nobody's saying anything about possible organized crime figures, neo-Nazis, terrorists. We're hearing none of the usual phony hysteria and fake fear that they would be doing if the Ukrainians were black. What I'm saying is there's a context to everything, even this. And what's happening here and how this war and the efforts to respond to it affect black people, that's the main context that's being ignored. Apparently, it doesn't fit the convenient white media narrative. And another thing that doesn't fit the white media narrative is the fact that the U.S. has found all these hundreds of millions of dollars overnight that they can go ahead and throw at people on the other side of the world. And they're not concerned about what these people do with it. Oh, just take the money. It doesn't matter what you're going to do with it. Just go ahead and take the money. It's too important for you not to have it. They couldn't find any money for black people in their Lift Every Voice plan, which, by the way, never got enacted. Oh yeah, all those black folks that they said they were going to do stuff for, well, they couldn't find money for us, but they could find money for people of color, which means everyone but black people. And they could find money for minorities, which also means white women. But what they can't find is anything for black people. That would just be too much. And now what they're saying is inflation's about to go through the roof. The prices for everything's about to go through the roof. But don't worry about that. When you're filling your gas tank, if you don't have enough money to pay for it, well, I'm sure that you'll be able to fill it with the warm glow of knowing that you stuck it to Vladimir Putin. Well, you have to forgive me if I don't get a warm glow from seeing that yet again black people, who are the most oppressed people on the planet, have been overlooked once again in favor of people who are not even U.S. citizens. Charity's supposed to begin at home before it spreads abroad, but under white supremacy, the world's been turned on its head, so charity begins everywhere else and it never makes it home, especially if black people are in the house. Forget about a ban on Russian oil. What's really called for is a ban on anti-black racism. But of course, there's no way that Biden, the Democrats, Republicans, or the white media are going to take any part in trying to stop a war that they all have been fighting against us. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Ricky Davis, Laura Binney, Daryl Banks, William Johnson, and Leroy Lasenberg. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.